to be killing a sacred cow today. That sacred cow is the Federal Reserve. Now, I'm probably not going to be going where you think I'm going to be going with this, because I'm not actually going to be killing the Federal Reserve. I'm going to be killing probably what you think about the Federal Reserve. So, there's this idea that's been going around for a while that I used to firmly believe is that the Federal Reserve is a private organization that controls the nation's money supply when it entirely doesn't need to. The country can make its own money on its own, but it has given up control over the nation's money supply to this private organization owned by unknown shareholders that are likely connected, or they themselves are international banksters that print the money at interest, and in order to pay back the interest, the government has to tax the local population in order to pay this interest on money that the government could have just printed in the first place. And when it can't tax enough, it actually has to go back and borrow from the Federal Reserve in order to pay the Federal Reserve. And every time it does this, it just increases the interest that is required to be paid back with future generations of taxpayer money. Our great-great-great-great-grandchildren are going to be infinitely paying off this burden that could only get greater, because every time the money gets created through the Federal Reserve, more money is owed back than is actually created, and you can never, ever, ever get out of that loop. And the problem behind all of this is that the Federal Reserve is a private organization that gets to socialize, that gets to privatize its profits and socialize its losses. Now, if this is true, this is a very big problem, right? Because the inevitability of an economic crash is built into the system, right? This is like the Austrian Peter Schiff style thing of like, oh my God, it's going to crash at any moment. It's going to crash at any moment, and it does crash. But eventually, there's supposed to be like the big one. There's supposed to be the big one, where the whole thing crashes and never is able to come back, in which case we better buy gold, we better buy bullets, we better go hide up in the woods and just bunker down and wait for this inevitable crash when this worthless money finally actually is shown to everybody to be worthless. And if the Federal Reserve is private and the story that I described is true, then maybe that is a rational course of action. However, if the Federal Reserve is not private, it's an arm of government, and it doesn't quite function the way I just described, the solution that is generally prescribed, as I just described, might not be the best thing for you to do. So I wanted to take some time to look into this, because I myself was on board with the fact that the Federal Reserve is private and all the things that I just said previously were true. And as I've grown and read and become more knowledgeable, it has come to my attention that that is indeed not the case. How do I prove that? Well, watch the video and find out. So, whether you've come to this realization that the Federal Reserve is private through The Creature from Jekyll Island or anything, any speech that J. Edward Griffin has made, the American Monetary Institute, with people like Bill Still and Steven Zarlinga, have produced things like The Money Masters and written books like The Lost Science of Money, that even though J. Edward Griffin and the American Monetary Institute have different solutions that they would want to put forward, they both agree on the basic premise, is that here's this private bank, this private organization that charges interest on the money that it creates. And if you've come from that arena, if you've come from that area, I could totally see why you would think that's the case. But what's really interesting is that in all this sleuthing and all this research, nobody really appears to have read the Federal Reserve Act or any of the official Federal Reserve material, because when you read it, you get a very, very different picture. So I wanted to go over some of the things that are just immediately readily available and really ask ourselves the question as we go through this: is the Federal Reserve really a private organization, or is it public institution. And I think by the time we get to this end of the video, that it's going to be pretty clear. Federal Reserve was created by an act of Congress, right? So first and foremost, that this is an act of government which creates this entire apparatus. Now, what gets confusing, and you'll see this as we start going into the language of the act itself, is that there is a lot of corporate terminology used, like members, shareholders, profits, net income, that sort of thing, which you could really, I mean, if you just took it at face value and say, hey, look, here's this language that's associated with private organizations. See, it's private. But if we look at the way that the Federal Reserve Act defines these terms, I think we might get a different picture. So first, I want to look at the Federal Reserve website. So let me pull this up here. And the first thing I want to point out is this is federalreserve.gov. And in order to even have a .gov website, there's a regulation that says you have to be a government organization. Now, I don't know if that's enough to just stop the conversation right there. I'm going to keep going anyway, but that is a kind of a first indicator that we might not be working with a private organization. So this here is the Federal Reserve website. It has the Federal Reserve Act text written on here. And I'm going to go first to Section 10. This is the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. So when we look at this, the Board of Governors is like the top power of the Federal Reserve after the government itself, after Congress and the president itself. So the Board of Governors is composed of 7 members. It says this right in the first sentence, and also in the first sentence, they are to be appointed by the president. So this flies in the face of one of the things I said at the beginning, is my original understanding from reading The Creature from Jekyll Island and Bill Still's Money Masters and all that sort of stuff, is that, or was that, the president only chose the chairman, and confirmed by the Senate, and everything else was private, and the government didn't have any other control after that. As it turns out, there are 7 members on the board, and all 7 of them are appointed by the president by and with advice and consent of the Senate. So the whole governing apparatus up top is chosen by the government, the whole thing. And then if you scroll down a little bit more, when you get into the how the chairman and vice chairman are selected, let's see, it's right here. Of the persons thus appointed, it's referring to the 7 members, 1 shall be designated by the president, and 2 shall be designated by president to be chairman, and 2 shall be designated by the president to be vice chairman. The first of which is the deputy chairman, and he serves in case the chairman is not there. Boring role. But the second one, this is more interesting, is the vice chairman of supervision. The vice chairman of supervision shall develop policy recommendations for the board regarding supervision and regulation of depository institution holding companies and other financial firms supervised by the board, and shall oversee the supervision and regulation of such firms. That's a pretty powerful and important point, and so far it's been 100% government getting us there, right? Act of Congress makes the thing, members chosen by the president, and then confirmed by the Senate, and then same thing with the chairman and both vice chairmen, one of which is this guy who supervises all this stuff. So at this point, we've got government from the top. Now, if we're going to talk about the members, because that's one of the big things, it's like, okay, yeah, all right, Dylan, so the government's involved here. What about the members? There's these unknown members that make up the Federal Reserve that get all the profits. Okay, let's look at the members. Okay, so if we go to the Federal Reserve Districts, this is Section 2. So the Board of Governors is up top, and underneath the Board of Governors, you have the individual districts. I think there's like 12 or 13. These are the actual banks. So it's my understanding there isn't really much financial stuff that goes on at the board level. That's just governance stuff. The financial machinations actually happen within the individual districts. So if we go to Section 2, Part 3, it says subscription to stock by national banks. There's our word stock, right? If we had stock in a company, this would indicate some sort of private ownership within that company. But if we look at this a little closely, under regulations to be prescribed by the organization committee, which was the committee put together by the government to originally form this stuff, every national banking association in the United States is required, and every eligible bank in the United States and trust companies within the District of Columbia is hereby authorized to signify in writing, except within 60 days of the passage of this act, its acceptance of the terms. So, first off, the Federal Reserve Act forces all these organizations to accept the terms of the Federal Reserve Act. And one of the terms are, let's see where to go. Every national banking association within that district or each individual district shall be required within 30 days after notice to subscribe to the capital stock of the such Federal Reserve Bank. So whatever individual district that they're under, in a sum equal to 6% of the paid up capital, some complicated formula for figuring out how much stock they have to buy. But what's important here isn't how much stock they have to buy, but individual banks are required to buy stock. National banks. Do you know what a national bank is? Yes, in other countries, a national bank is a way of saying central bank. We don't use that term in this country. In this country, national bank refers to any bank that operates in more than one state. That's a whole heck of a lot of them. And even if you don't operate in more than one state, there's another section in here somewhere. Where was it? Yeah, state banks as members. I'm not even going to open it up. I'll just describe it. Even if you're a state bank, there's this weird aspect of banking in this country where you get to choose what regulations you follow. Like, you could choose to be regulated by the FDIC. You could choose to be regulated by the comptroller of the currency. You could choose to be regulated by the Federal Reserve. There might be more. I don't know. Those are the three that I know off the top of my head. If you choose to be regulated by the Federal Reserve, so I could go start a bank. I file the appropriate paperwork. I have enough assets or whatever, and I open up shop here, I guess. I could choose to become a member of the Federal Reserve, at which point, by law, I am required to subscribe to Federal Reserve stock. So there's your answer to who the Federal Reserve members are. It's every national bank and every, we'll call it local bank for lack of a better term, every local bank that chooses to subscribe to the to be regulated by the Federal Reserve has to subscribe to stock. There's no hidden members. There's no international banker Rothschild freaking. Not saying the Rothschilds don't influence this thing, but in terms of who owns the bank, this isn't ownership, right? We're going to see in a minute what control banks have from this stock. Excuse me. We're going to see in a second what ownership or what control banks have through this stock, but it's not like these are owners that get to operate outside of the realm of government. No, this is the realm of government saying, hey, you got to do what we say here, and one of the things we say is you need to subscribe to this stock. So if you want to know who the members are, just look up any national bank or go to the FDIC data tool. Seriously, there's a data tool. You can look up any bank in the country, and it'll tell you who they're regulated by. Like, all this stuff. This is all public information. You can figure out who the members are. It's not a secret. Okay. So if we go over now to the Federal Reserve banks, so these are the individual districts that we're talking about. If you read through this, and I'm not going to read it word for word, each individual district has its, here goes over some of the corporate powers these individual districts have. And if we look at this, sections 10, 11, and 12. Each individual Federal Reserve district has a board of directors that consists of 9 members. And there are 3 classes of those 9 members, and 3 of each class. There's Class A, Class B, and Class C. So when we look at what each of these individual members consist of, Class A directors shall consist of 3 members who shall be chosen by and be representative of the stockholding banks. Okay, so here's our first level of private, right? Here's our first level of private, that the stockholding banks, who are required by law to have that stock, have voting capacity, and it gets down here somewhere, here nomination and election and preferential ballots, how that actually plays out. But yes, 3 of the 9 members are chosen by the banks to be representative of the banks at the Federal Reserve District Board for the individual districts. There's point 1 for private. The Class B directors shall consist of 3 members who shall represent the public. and with due but not exclusive consideration to the interests of agriculture, commerce, industry, services, labor, and consumers. Now, if we go down here on Section 14, it's very clear that no director of Class B shall be an officer, director, or employee of any bank. So, I mean, I'm not saying that, you know, a sneaky group of Illuminati overlords couldn't get around getting their people in here. But the law is very clear, like you can't be an employee or associated with a bank in order to be one of these Class B directors. Now, it doesn't say right here, but it details it somewhere else. I can't remember where. These are also chosen by the stockholder banks, the member banks. So, okay, 6 out of the 9 of the board of directors of each individual district are selected by the banks. Looks like we do have some private power outweighing the public power here. Just wait until we get to the Class C directors. Class C directors shall consist of 3 members who shall be designated by the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. So now we're back to government. Remember, the Board of Governors is chosen entirely by the government, and now these people chosen entirely by the government for a government institution created by the government with a .gov website, they designate these Class C directors. So I would say these Class C directors are public. The Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System shall appoint Class C directors and shall designate one of such directors as chairman of the board to be selected. Okay, so we do have, first and foremost, this 6 private, 3 public, but the main man, the chairman of the district, the individual stockholders get no choice over that whatsoever. The people chosen by the government up top, they get to choose from the bottom. And that person from the bottom, no director of Class C shall be an officer, director, employee, or even a stockholder of any bank. So even if you own stock in a private bank, you can't be the chairman of a Federal Reserve district. Now, there's an additional power here. It was mixed in right here. So these are this is part 4, section 4, part 4, general corporate powers. The 5th of the general corporate powers of the individual district banks, Federal Reserve banks, is to appoint by its board of directors a president and vice president and such officers and employees as are not otherwise provided in this act. Now, the president shall be the chief executive officer of the bank and shall be appointed by Class B and Class C directors of the bank with the approval of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. So, I mean, again, the representatives of the bank for the banks, they don't even get to vote. They have nothing to say whatsoever in terms of who is the chairman. And then the chief executive officer, Class A doesn't even get to vote. Only Class B. And then, or excuse me, Classes B and C. So, okay, now we got 3, in quotes, private, but nobody represented the banks. 3 private, and then 3 government, and then whoever they choose still has to be approved by the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. So, this is, I mean, it's just like public, almost all the way down. We finally hit private. Private is given space at the table, but almost all the powers are removed from them. And I think it's worth pointing out that there's nothing particularly unique with this government bureaucracy, the Federal Reserve System, by including private people in its board of directors. Lots of government bureaucracies do this, and I think the idea is that we want to include members of the public in private industry, and whether it's healthcare, or finance, or airplane part, whatever. We want to include the public so we can have their feedback and their input when we're doing the process of making these regulations. Now, of course, it's very easy to control who gets on there, and it's not like the public is even aware this is going on and know that they should participate anyway. So I don't think this is like a big opportunity for the public to step in and go, hey, I want my voice to be heard, and how this gets directed. It's pretty well controlled. But the point being, even this private aspect that we have within this Federal Reserve System, it's not unique to this particular bureaucracy. So far, there's nothing about this description. There's nothing about this organization that we've gone through that suggests that it's private. So that leads us actually to the real big aspect of, okay, Dylan, sure, you've described all this stuff. We see that all of it's, okay, yeah, it's government and it's not private. So what? It's still charging interest on money. And who's getting that money? I'm glad you asked, because I believe that is the most important question. Because whether or not this is private or public, the question is, who benefits? Well, in order to answer that, I'm going to go over to some Federal Reserve financials. And before we get into those financials, I do want to look at, where'd it go? Right here. There's a claim that goes on, and Ron Paul repeats this claim incessantly, that nobody's audited the Fed in however many decades or since its inception or whatever it is. Now, I don't know if these people haven't read this section. There's one sentence. It's not very complicated. This is Section 11B, Annual Independent Audits of the Federal Reserve Banks and Board. The board shall order an annual independent audit of the financial statements of each Federal Reserve Bank and the board. So the Fed has been audited. It gets audited every year. It says it right here. Anyway, so looking at some of those audited financials about what they do with this money. So this is the Federal Reserve Bank's combined quarterly financial report. Oh, this one's unaudited. Oh, yeah, because it's not annual. This is Q2, June 30th of 2022. Now, when you look at these numbers, keep in mind that these are in millions, so you need to add 3 zeros. So if this says 11,037, this is actually $11,037 billion in gold certificates. Ooh, do you wish you had $11 trillion in gold certificates? That'd be pretty nifty. Now, scrolling down here, there's a number that I really want, which is right here. So you scroll down, and it says the Reserve Bank and consolidated variable interest entities net income before providing for remittances to the Treasury. So this says roughly 31,000, and if we add 6 zeros, that turns into 31 trillion. So in Q2 2022, the Federal Reserve System, the combined banks, had a net profit of approximately $31 trillion. What did they do with it? Well, let's look at the next line. Earning remittances to the Treasury, $30.56 trillion. If you do the math, that comes out to more than 98%. So all this profit, all this interest money that the Federal Reserve earns is turned around and given to the U.S. government. Let me say that again. All the money, 98% of the money that the Federal Reserve earns gets turned around and is given to the U.S. government. What private institution do you know that gives 98% of its revenue, not its revenue, its net income to the U.S. government? Well, yeah, I got to pay 1/3 of my money in income tax. Yeah, that's a whole heck of a lot less than 98%. 98%, I mean, that's essentially 100%. And the remaining 2%, as best as my understanding, is there is a return on that capital stock that the national banks have to, the national banks or any other member bank has to acquire. And, it mentioned it back here. Yeah, so this is part 3, or excuse me, section 3, part 2 again, where every national banking association has to subscribe to the capital stock equal to 6% of the paid up capital stock and surplus of such bank, 1/6 of the subscription to be payable on call to the organizational committee of the board, blah, 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 blah. So they have to own a certain stock by this calculation. And I'm not going to find it in here. You can look this up yourself. But there is a part of the Federal Reserve Act that specifically describes how much return an individual bank can get on this stock. And there's a complicated way of calculating it, but then the second part says this maxes out at 6%. So if we just take that 6% number, if I started a bank and I had to buy $10,000 of capital stock in the Federal Reserve because that's the law, I could at most hope for $600 a year on that $10,000. That's what the other 2% is. So yes, there's some kickback there, but it's not financially significant. I mean, we interviewed Warren Mosler here one time, who used to own a bank, and he pointed this out. He said, "Yeah, I got this kickback from the Federal Reserve, but it wasn't like it was some sort of significant amount of money that I was able to use." So again, I think that's really, really the kicker here, is that 98% of the profit goes to the federal government. It doesn't need to get paid back. Nobody needs to be taxed for this stuff, right? This is all different accounting entries, and it does not work like a normal bank, right? This does not work like a normal bank. This does not work like a private institution or even private lending institution. This is the federal government that has the sole authority to coin money. Like, oh, but it says gold and silver in the Constitution. They're not supposed to do that. Sure. I'm not disagreeing that things aren't done the way that they were supposed to be done. But in terms of how the system actually works, the Federal Reserve is a branch of the government. It is federal, and it is a reserve. I'm not going into why it's a reserve in this video, but it is federal, and it creates the money. Right? It doesn't need to tax to get that money back because it creates the money. So these are just different accounting entries. And based on how the accounting entries go, some of that money gets to go back to be used by the U.S. Treasury. In conclusion here. Okay, Dylan, fine. You've proved, but this is actually from the Federal Reserve website, so I don't actually believe it. Okay, so you don't believe the Act of Congress, like literally what the Act of Congress says, and what's printed on the Federal Reserve website in terms of their financials based on what the Act of Congress has told them to do. Fine. Okay, if that's the case, then go watch something else. But the conclusion here is, if you want to fix things, you have to understand how the system actually works. Now, I'm not saying this to say that everything's hunky-dory with the financial system. This is great. I'm not like giving this my stamp of approval. There are serious issues wrong with the way that our central bank works. And in fact, if you want to know like a concise and not realistic, that's not the word I want. Accurate, that's the word I want. If you want a concise and accurate understanding of how the Federal Reserve System works and the problems with it, you want to go to Professor Richard Werner's website. He's got an article on it that breaks it down unbelievably well. And the issue is, if you want to fix a system, you have to know how it actually works. And going back to what I said originally, if you're afraid that the entire system's going to crash because we're based on this Federal Reserve System that's going to crash everything in its entirety because it's siphoning off the productive labor of everybody by charging interest on creating the money that's owned by these international banksters that nobody knows who they are. Yeah, it makes sense to go hide in the woods with a bunch of food and ammo and gold. I disagree on the gold, but you get what I'm talking about. But if it doesn't work that way, then your solution is crap. You need to find a better solution. And like I said, I think if you go check out Professor Richard Werner, you're gonna get some better solutions. And also, if this is the case, it also means that the crash isn't this like big crash that has to happen isn't around the corner. That the Fed does not need to because the Fed does not need to tax, or the government doesn't need to tax to pay the Fed. That's entirely a myth. It doesn't have to happen. These are all just accounting entries that the Fed changes around, that the financial system changes around. We've come here because of a very erroneous understanding of how economics works. The central bank narrative is a microcosm of the entirety of how economics works. And we talk about this all the time on the show. We'll keep talking about it again. I'm zooming in here on the Federal Reserve for now. But the neoclassical understanding of economics, which is like the official government academic understanding of how economics works, and its supposed enemy, the Austrian School of Economics, both agree on fundamental principles that are completely wrong. They're completely erroneous. They have nothing to do with describing reality. They have economic principles that have absolutely nothing to do with describing economic reality. If we have that as our understanding, we're just spinning around in a circle, fighting over stuff that doesn't matter, fighting over stuff that doesn't exist, preparing for problems that aren't going to come because those problems don't actually exist when other problems are actually happening. Okay? This system can totally be controlled by a cabal of secret Illuminati overlords, but the same way they control everything else, right? I mean, they have their secret meetings and they get their people, they get their fingers and everything, and they control it that way. I'm not saying that isn't happening. I think it is happening, but it's not happening the way you think it is. And to emphasize the point that I want to make here, I got a comic I want to share. This is SMBC Comics. We'll zoom in a little here. A little too much. And I think this guy's a little bit of a lefty, but he really nails it on a lot of things. And whenever he does well, this one's not about economics, but he does a lot of economics comics, and he just kills it. Like, I don't know if he knows what the right answer is, but he's definitely good at pointing out how dumb the mainstream economic understanding is. But anyway, this is, if you're listening to this and not watching, it opens up saying, TV show idea, a 17th century medical drama. So this opens with an experienced, in quotes, doctor here, which looks like to be in a Puritan hat, and a rookie right next to him, and this guy dying on the ground. And the experienced doctor says, he's got too much blood and too much bile. The rookie says, they never taught me about this in chirurgeon school. The doctor says, damn your books, rookie, this is life and death. We've got to bleed and purge him at the same time. The rookie says, how? The doctor says, stab in the bowels. We can get the excess blood and bile out in one stroke. And the rookie goes, but that's never been tried before. Watch me. And then minutes later, doctor says, we lost him. And the rookie goes, have you noticed that we always lose them? Followed by, shut up, rookie. Now, why is this funny? It's funny because the system being described here, this idea like, oh, there's the sickness is being caused by too much blood and too much bile, we know is a false description of how the body works. So he comes up with a solution, stab him in the bowels in order to get the bad fluids out as a solution, but we know now stabbing someone in the bowel just kills them, right? So in the same way, if we want to come up with a solution, end the Fed, if we can get rid of the Fed and get rid of the private banking control over our financial system, everything will be better. Well, that's the equivalent of stabbing in the bowels in this comic. It's not the way it works. And if you want to figure out how it works, listen to this show more, but also check out people like Professor Werner and check out Modern Money Theory. I know it has gotten a bad rep, but we do our best to separate the leftist nonsense that gets wrapped around it and what it actually, what modern money theory actually describes here on the show. So I want you to take this to heart. Well, I pointed to my head when I said to heart. Take this to your head, take this to your heart, and share this, because this is really a sacred cow that I think is preventing people from moving forward and coming up with actual solutions to fixing the severe and egregious problems within our society, and particularly the financial realm, because the Team Freedom, and I like to say that I'm on Team Freedom, that Irida TV is for Team Freedom, the Team Freedom interpretation is generally that the Federal Reserve is private. And if you question that, it's a sacred cow that it's just assumed, oh, well, then you must be on Team Illuminati Overlord. Why don't you just go join the Rothschilds and microchip yourself and plug into the Matrix and get vaccinated and sign up for digital currency? That's not what I'm talking about. If you want to fix a system, you have to understand how the system actually works, and the amount of doublethink, the amount of cognitive dissonance that's out there. And this happened to me too, in order to cover up what is so simply read on the damn Federal Reserve website is astounding. And I'm hoping I could at least start to break the spell by making this video. So this has been Dylan Moore with Irida TV. Come back often to get cool content like this. Irida.tv.